a real treat for you. I'll introduce him in a moment. First, as you know, we usually like to start with reading a brief passage of Scripture, a prayer, and I'll read this section that was selected. This is from Genesis, the first chapter, and about the creation of Adam, the creation of man. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." This is the new RSV, okay? "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female. He created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living thing that moves on the earth." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Lord, thank you for giving us your word, and thank you for this fellowship, this friendship that we have together. We, as usual, we'd like to ask that you will help us to listen and meet and understand and seek to grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. In his name, amen. We have Daniel Spiro with us today, and I'm just going to read a little bit about his background. He wears many hats. At least, you'll hear more about his different hats. He works full-time as an attorney doing litigation for the Department of Justice, corporate litigation. So you can imagine him in a courtroom wrangling with these high-powered lawyers up from K Street. That's his daily job. But he also coordinates the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society of Washington and the Washington Spinoza Society, both of which he founded. He's active working for peace in the Middle East and is the author of some other books, The Creed Room and Moses the Heretic. And he has these books for sale on the back table here. So after the class, please take a look at his interesting books. I met Daniel at a meeting of the local science religion discussion group that we have that meets monthly. So he's homegrown talent, and he understands life inside the Beltway. He's been working in this area for a long time, and I call this stuff boundary work, where you're trying to bring together communities that typically are separate. And that borderline is where things get interesting, because people don't think alike. And it challenges us. You know, the proverb, iron sharpens iron. It's that idea. He likes to be sharpened up by other people. So you will have a good time wrestling with him this morning. So Daniel, thank you for coming and sharing with us. Take it away.
You know, it doesn't follow that I'm homegrown. I could be one of these millions of lawyers that come in from other parts of the country. I am actually a graduate of Fernwood Elementary, North Bethesda Junior High, and Walter Johnson High School, so I am very humble. So, as an author, you can't necessarily affect what other people think of or do with your work, but you can let your work affect you. And what I have tried to do when I finish a book is use it to champion a cause. So my first book, The Creed Room, was about a diverse group of people who were brought together by a mysterious benefactor to somehow fashion a creed that would unify our society. And they are responsible for the re-election of George W. Bush in 2004. But they are also responsible for inspiring me to become a bridge builder, a unifier. And I'm not sure I could say I was that before I wrote that book. The second book, Moses the Heretic, is a philosophical novel which is sort of based on the old saw, what would Jesus do? Only, of course, mine was, what would Moses do? If there is a contemporary rabbi who lived like Moses, how would he live? And I decided he would be a bridge builder. So, for example, this contemporary rabbi embraced Islam as a complement to Judaism. And when I finished the book, it inspired me to start the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society of Washington. And I should say that organization includes plenty of Christians, sort of like GLBT organizations have, quote, allies. We have Christians who are allies. who are sort of pro-peace and pro-bridge building, and support what it means to be first cousins in the family of Abraham, which is how we refer to each other in JIDS. My third book, which I'm going to talk about today, is Liberating the Holy Name. A free thinker grapples with the meaning of divinity. And more than anything else, this book has inspired me to talk to different communities about the need to change the way we talk about God. Now, I'm not talking about the way we talk about God to ourselves. I'm talking about the way we refer to God when we are addressing others. I would say that the change is needed because otherwise we are going to continue, at least in our affluent societies, to move away from religion and towards a mindset that does away with the sense of the sublime and a sense of the eternal. So I have dedicated the book to those who fight religious apathy and religious fanaticism. And as you know, everybody in the media loves to talk about religious fanaticism. But precious few want to talk about religious apathy. And perhaps that's one reason why I think it's so important to confront. As this group knows better than most, the name Israel comes from a spiritual struggle which our patriarch Jacob engaged in with an angel of God. And we Jews like to say that Jacob was engaged in God wrestling. We like to claim Jacob as our role model for engaging in these fundamental questions about God. And the last thing I would argue that a Jew is supposed to do is to be apathetic about God. To me, it is far more religiously Jewish to say "niet" 1,000 times to the existence of God than it is to say, I just don't care. Mm-hmm. And yet, I think it is safe to say that when you look at the group of people alive today who self-identify as Jews, a huge portion have become apathetic about the holy name. I'm not sure we're living up to our claims as God wrestlers. Something has gone very wrong in that regard, and we are not alone. Whether apathy is simply whether it is the cause or simply the effect, there is no denying that people in our world are, getting less and less sustenance from religion. I'd like to address a poll the Pew Institute did shortly after the dawn of this millennium, where people in various countries were asked if religion was very important to them. 1 in 9 Frenchmen said yes. 1 in 8 Japanese. 1 in 7 Russians. 1 in 5 Germans. 1 in 4 Italians. 1 in 3 Brits. Here in the United States, the numbers are somewhat higher. But I'm not sure we can say that about cities like my city, your city, or New York, or San Francisco. Throughout America, and especially in affluent, educated areas, the fastest growing faith is none of the above. I remember riding in a car with a Christian cleric who mentioned that his 2 kids are nuns. Well, I can sort of relate to that. I've got a daughter in rabbinical school and another one who's probably going to end up in rabbinical school if she's about to graduate from college. But then it hit me. This guy's a Protestant, not a Catholic. His kids are N-O-N-E-S, nuns.
Oh.
And I'm sure they see themselves and their fellow travelers as the wave of the future. Well, we hear a lot about the so-called new atheists like Bill Maher and Richard Dawkins, who have nothing to say about religion but to tear it down. Many nuns, though, of course, are not unabashed atheists. They're just people who think that God talk is pointless speculation. We've been schooled to think that learning is a process of acquiring information and gathering skills. And there's little room in that mindset for contemplating the eternal mysteries, let alone revering the eternal mysteries. And you can understand why clerics are not so troubled by this phenomenon, because those who come to church are the ones who want to hear what they have to say. But what about the people who don't come? What about the teenagers and young adults who just want to ignore religion altogether? I don't want people to ignore religion any more than I want them to ignore art or music or literature. But of course, we all realize it's a tragedy when people ignore the latter. It's become accepted when they want to ignore religion. Many people look at it as nothing more than a bunch of silly superstitions, and the last thing they want to talk about is God, who is considered a figment of our imaginations. So what can we do to make people care when the word God is used in their presence? Love it or hate it, just care, right? I believe we must start with a recognition that the same thing as strangling our spiritual lives that is strangling our political lives, and that is called polarization. In one corner, you'll find the people that I've been talking about, the nuns, as well as those who self-identify with a particular faith but don't really feel passionate about it. In the other corner, you'll find the religious supernaturalists, who are served by an abundance of churches and megachurches who espouse the old-time religion, the one based on traditional interpretations of Scripture, and the supernatural Lord who judges us on the basis of our faith. Now, these two groups obviously don't cover the waterfront. Many people who distance themselves from religious supernaturalism don't want to give up on religion altogether. But they commonly remain at sea when it comes to finding a spiritual home. In that sense, they're like political independents who get so disillusioned with the process that they don't even bother to vote. Some people are open to the idea of religion, but because of the polarized environment, they just give up. Well, what's polarizing is paralyzing. It prevents people in a society from engaging in great enterprises like fighting the Nazis or going to the moon. And to me, as a non-traditional but spiritual Jew, religious paralysis is no healthier than political paralysis. It breeds apathy, creates a vacuum, and allows extremists on both sides to carry the day. But to confront this paralysis, we must first isolate its root causes. And this morning I'd like to address one of those causes. And it's an ironic cause, because it pertains to an issue on which the religious supernaturalists and the outspoken atheists actually agree. I'm referring to the meaning of the word God. Words have a denotation and they have common connotations. So when I say the word snake, the denotation is a reptile that slithers on the ground. But the common connotation is, treachery, untrustworthy, the characteristics associated with people who practice law for a living, like I do. But fortunately, for those of us who are members of the bar, when most people say the word snake, they have in mind the denotation, and that's as it should be. But the word God is different. With this word, we ignore the denotation, and that is what is so tragic. The accepted denotation of the word God is the ultimate. To demonstrate that, let me remind you that when people talk about, this Jack's God is money, or Jill's God is power, they mean that for them, money or power is the ultimate concern. But we also call them false gods, because we all know that deep down, money or power is not what is truly the ultimate. The real God, if there is a God, the real ultimate one, is clothed in mystery. Who are we as human beings to truly understand what is the ultimate? But the word God doesn't just have a denotation, it also has a most common connotation. And it is on that point where the religious supernaturalists and the outspoken atheists strangely agree. When they say God, they're referring to the Lord of Scripture, the immortal, invisible, omniscient, omnibenevolent, we call it omni-excellent, supreme being who created all in accordance with his, quote-unquote, inscrutable will. Many atheists and supernaturalists have practically an unspoken conspiracy to define God in just that way, because they have so much at stake in their definition being the correct one. They ask the rest of us to say yay or nay. If you answer in the affirmative, then you're taken to be religious. If you answer in the negative, you're taken to be a non-believer. And that perspective helps feed the polarizing, paralyzing attitude that reigns supreme in our society. If only, however, the word God could be associated with a denotation like the word snake. This could help usher in an era of soul-searching, intercultural dialoguing, and even some social unity. I remember when I was in college and my friends and I would stay up to all hours of the night listening to Bob Dylan or Pink Floyd, and we'd be talking about religion or political theory or some other lofty domain, and we passionately disagreed with each other. But we still felt like brothers and sisters, because we knew that we would learn at least as much from those who disagreed with us as with those who agreed with us. When you think of God as the ultimate, and your goal is to search your soul as to what that means, you embark on a lifelong journey for truth and meaning. And then when someone calls themselves a non-believer, your reaction is, well, non-believer in what? Cosmic unity? The transcendent realm that lies beyond that of human perception? To be a religious searcher is to open your mind to different religions and philosophies and then work your intuitions into the mix. It can lead you from theism to atheism to pantheism back to theism, but you're always just searching. And the word God, this mysteriously unifying, potentially unifying symbol, can become the most liberating notion imaginable. Because no human being can ever fully understand the ultimate. You never have to feel badly that you haven't solved this riddle. And you never have to feel jealous when you encounter someone who claims that he or she has. Unfortunately, the idea of the religious search remains for most of us a fringe activity. Most of us would rather blow off this search out of boredom, right? Or join one of the established teams, the religious supernaturalists or the non-believers. Well, we hear the words fundamentalist a lot to refer to certain religious supernaturalists, but believe me, there are fundamentalists on the non-believer side as well. Like Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion. Now, Dawkins said he was willing to recognize that there are folks like Einstein or his hero Spinoza who conceive of God differently than the supernaturalists and still use the term God. But then he said, and this is a quote from Dawkins, "I wish that physicists would refrain from using the word God in their special metaphorical sense. The metaphorical or pantheistic God of the physicists is light years away from the interventionist, miracle-wreaking, thought-reading, sin-punishing, prayer-answering God of the Bible, of priests, mullahs, and rabbis, and of ordinary language. To deliberately confuse the two is an act of intellectual high treason." Unquote. I did not write that. That, my friends, is the voice of fundamentalism. That's Bill Maher's hero, right? Dawkins' idea of God would be shared by the same clerics who he was mocking. They too might insist that for Spinoza or Einstein to claim to love God is an insult to the holy name. Because everybody knows that the only God worthy of the name is the God of the Bible, as that God is traditionally depicted. In other words, if you don't believe that the ultimate is exactly as they conceive of the ultimate, you must not be a true believer. In this way, the battle lines are drawn. And the rest of us, who want to search for truth and meaning with an open mind and an open heart, we are in dead man's land. You see, this is a battle worthy of World War I. Primitive, destructive, and ultimately pretty pointless. We can do better. So I come to you today on behalf of an idea that you can actually teach your children. Obviously, it's had some success in my family, right? Because it should appeal to any open-minded soul who grows up in this land of liberty. And that is that the name of God must be liberated. When in conversation with one another, the holy name should arise. We should try to recognize what the word denotes, and that it is up to us as individuals to choose for ourselves what type of connotation to give it. So in seeking polarization, or liberation from polarization and paralysis, I differentiate between the name of God on the one hand and the divine on the other. The name belongs to us. It is a word. It is a tool. It is a concept in our minds. Now, I know it's powerful, but it is just a word. But the divine, the true God, that's not someone or something we possess. That's what we can only begin to summon. We don't locate the divine within our thoughts. We locate our thoughts and our bodies within the divine. And yes, it is empowering to think about the name. But it is humbling to think about the divine mystery. Those who contemplate that mystery would find it extremely difficult to be a fundamentalist of any kind. So instead, they become seekers, people who revere the search for wisdom more than the possession of knowledge. Well, I've been engaged in this search for truth and meaning about God for virtually my entire life. It began when I was maybe 5 or so, and I received a little picture book. I'm sorry my Muslim friends cannot relate to this. It had Abraham on the cover. A patriarch, or should they say prophet, right? Standing on the beach, gazing at the starry sky. Beautiful picture. I'm trying to think. He looks like, what's his name from Homeland? Saul from Homeland. What's his name? The actor. I can't remember his name. The old Jewish guy. His hands are upraised, and he was clearly at prayer. And that book introduced me to the nurturing God that has been the beloved of so many children, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, you name it. And that sense of God gives us a feeling of being blessed, enchanted, cared for, but also, and this is critical, commanded. Many of the same elements of spirituality that I have today come from seeds that were planted in that book that came from the 1950s. But no sooner did I fall in love with that book that I gained exposure to a different book belonging to my maternal grandparents, not my aunt. They never showed me the book. I found it by mistake when I was 6 or 7. But once I saw it, I never forgot what it said, and even less its pictures. On the cover of the book was nothing but a symbol, a swastika. And inside, it had pictures of Jews who were killed, Jews that had swastikas put in their heads, windows with anti-Semitic language there. That was back before there was a state of Israel where if you were an anti-Semite, everybody knew it, right? You couldn't hide it then. But what was fascinating about that book, and yes, I got it when I was a kid. I understood the relevance of what I'm about to tell you. This book it was published in New York, right? It was not published in 1953 or 1943, but 1933. A few months after Hitler came to power. And believe me, I have often discussed the ramifications of that fact with Palestinians. Thanks to this book, when I was only 7 years old, I became obsessed with the Holocaust. It taught me many lessons, and one of the things I took from it was that this world is not the product of an omnibenevolent will. And in that conclusion, my parents offered me no resistance. It was my mother, who is a committed Marxist to this day, who once said to me, "If you believe in God, you're an idiot." That's a direct quote. And it was my father, more philosophical and subtle a thinker, who said, "Judaism has a layer of bullshit. Christianity added another." So, armed with an awareness of the Holocaust, not to mention deadly earthquakes in the field known as pediatric oncology, I became an atheist for the remainder of my childhood. But at least I cared. Well, then I went on to college. I accepted the idea of transcendence. I was a student of philosophy, and I'm thinking about that. I was also humble about the human condition and about our ability as humans to perceive all of reality and answer all these questions. And so after I graduated, I went to Israel, and I checked myself into a yeshiva, not a kibbutz, a yeshiva. And the rabbis there gave me two choices. I could either believe in a God that sort of has a plan for us, and a lot like the nurturing God I talked about, but a more mature version. Or I can have a hedonistic, kind of, nihilistic mindset. They excluded all other options. And I bought into it. So I became a believer. And I thought, God had a plan for me, and my job was to seek God's will and do it. And by the way, I've never not been a believer after that moment. So they've converted me. They turned me into a Baal Shuva, a born-again Jew. Well, I am no longer Orthodox, but I have never lost my appreciation for the Orthodox religion. And I have to say that members of Orthodox faiths who do not resort to violence and who do resort to compassion for people outside their community, I take my hat off to them. I feel that they're brothers and sisters. So just before law school, after this experience, a few months later, I was waiting for a bus, actually walking to the bus stop, and the bus came and left. I saw it, and I missed it. And I was saying, God, why did God plan for me to miss that bus? And then I thought, Dan, fill in the old expletive. Yeah, I cussed myself out. I think I'm, being an idiot, like my mother said, right? So I was just confused. What is going on here? And then about a year later, I sort of discovered Spinoza. Discovered this idea that you can become God intoxicated without sort of buying into hook, line, and sinker what the rabbis were teaching. I fell in love with the notion of unity, the radical, transcendent unity, overarching the all. I fell in love with the notion of substance. You think of a submarine, under, right? The ground of being, a Paul Tillich term. The substance that underlies everything that exists. And I fell in love with his notion that we should not anthropomorphize, and this is why the scriptural passage at the beginning was chosen, sort of ironically. I was telling Paul earlier that I'm part of a God panel, a Jew, a Christian, an imam, and an atheist to talk about God. And our Christian loves to talk about anthropomorphisms, and he believes in them. He says he loves anthropomorphism. He wants God to be depicted in a human-like way. It gives it fullness to him, richness. Well, that was not where I was coming from, and certainly not where Spinoza was coming from. Spinoza taught that to compare God's intellect and will with human intellect and will is like to compare the constellation of the dog with the animal that barks. And I love that. So after I became a Spinozist, I guess, I started exploring other perspectives, including the idea of God as a summoner, meeting God through I-thou relationships. I'm thinking about how a sort of Spinozistic version of God can be a little lifeless, a little abstract, a little thin, like a cosmic mechanical power generator. The word Martin Luther King Jr. used was subpersonal. I did not want subpersonal. I thought about the idea of God needing human beings. The idea that many philosophers like Heschel, of God actually suffering. Christian Unamuno talks about that. God actually suffering as a result of human injustice. I had Islam and Spinoza on the one hand, but I also had progressive Judaism and Christianity on the other. I wanted to matter to God, or more specifically, the issue to me wasn't, does God need us? The issue was, does God need us to be righteous? So I had all these ideas bouncing around in my head, all these traditions, all these ideas, and I needed to synthesize them. And it was that notion of a synthesis that came to define my conception of God. And to get there, I relied heavily on the two Abrahamic traditions other than my own. I want to say something about each. Well, first Islam. I feel blessed to have been exposed so heavily to the Muslim faith in recent years. There is such incredible beauty in the way Islam addresses the notion of divinity. No other religion, including my own, seems to place such emphasis on God's greatness, or more specifically, God's infinity. Infinite breadth, infinite power, infinite worth, infinite relevance. No wonder Muslims like to say, Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest, God is the biggest. I only wish that New Age Jews would take that mantra seriously. Encountering the Muslim respect for God has inspired me to treat the name with even more respect, and not to associate it with false gods, which for me means literally anything, holy or otherwise, that is less than ultimate. Well, I remember giving book talks after Moses the Heretic. And I would say to the group of Jewish listeners, can anybody name one thing that's uniquely beautiful about Islam? Uniquely beautiful. Radio silence. I would ask the same question about Christianity, and I would always get answers. And it would always be about the Gospels, the ethics, right? Taking Judaism in a certain direction. That's all I'm talking about with Islam. Christianity does that too, a beautiful ethical direction. But I didn't hear squadouche about the Trinity. Well, I've actually found inspiration from, I will say, Trinitarian thinking, as opposed to the Trinity. The. It's the same thing about liberating words. So for me, Trinitarian thinking is invaluable. You've got God as the ground of being, and you've got God as the life of being. The abyss, the mystery, and the concrete. And yes, these are Christian concepts. Only you don't hear me talking about the deification of Jesus. God grows in greatness when God subsumes these complementary dimensions. Depth and form, concrete and ground, cause and effect. This conception of God, as my Christian friend would say, becomes thick and meaningful. And I'm referring to the layered depth that is present in all great art, poetry, myth, and is essential to making any philosophy come alive right here in the human heart. You've got to do justice to the realm of the concrete. So my solution, in terms of seeing an ultimate that had some sustenance for me, is to, quote Franz Rosenzweig, see a world that is a bubbling plenitude, consisting of infinite variety and an overarching unity that ties together every mind and every body. And for me, the ultimate is the synthesis between the two. The synthesis of ultimates. The ground of being underlying everything that exists, and the life of being, the sum total of everything that was, is, and will be. I speak of God in both of those respects, as a Christian would speak of God in terms of each element of a Christian Trinity. But above all else, I speak of God as the synthesis of those ultimates. I think of God as truly boundless in every way, while the rest of us are finite in all or some respects. God, my God, is pure infinity. My God includes nature as we know it and the mystery that transcends what we know. The sum of all living forms and the source of life itself. So we've got multiplicity, but in its essence, radical unity. The ultimate synthesis. And because life is good to us, those of us who choose not to take our own lives, I see God as the ultimate benefactor. That at least is the connotation of the word that has relevance for me at this point in my life as a seeker. So it's still important for me to have, for this notion of God to be a relatively pure one, to rid myself of some of these anthropomorphisms. I want to worship God, not to worship the human ideal. So I don't want to be like the apes in the Planet of the Apes movies. You remember that, where they had the statue of the ape, the god Simos, who was created in their image? Or as Spinoza would say, if we were triangles, our God would be triangular. That is not where I'm coming from. But I do want to find a God in this world, find a way for our own lives to matter to God and not just to one another. So I want my God to be great, but I also want my God to be thick. I need that balance. So I want to say a few words about the next two parts of my book. The second part is God in the second person. I was just speaking about God in the third person. God as an object. Right? This is God as a thou. And really it's a challenge, to my rabbinical benefactors who taught me that we have to anthropomorphize God if God is to be relevant to us. And I think I've proven that that's nonsense. I'm not putting down the traditional conception of God. I'm only putting down the attempt to monopolize the ultimate with any one conception. Well, the roles that God plays for me when I am talking to God, right, are many of the same roles that God plays for traditional religious thinkers. I see God as a benefactor, a source of enchantment, a muse, a legitimate object of prayer, a friend, a commander, a beloved, a challenge. And largely what I'm talking about here is the true God, the divine. It's the divine who serves us as a benefactor and a source of infinite enchantment. But frequently what I'm referring to is the name, the holy name. The name is what inspires us. The name is what can serve as a reliable, helpful friend when we address God, right? The name is what commands our conscience. The name makes us feel not merely fortunate, but blessed to be alive. You can hardly oversell the power of that name. But for me, honoring the name requires that we be true to it. We can't treat the holy name as an it rather than a thou. Finally, the third and final part of my book. God in the first person. So at JIDS, as I mentioned, we refer to ourselves, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, as cousins. Cousin Paul, I mean, that's the way we might talk. But what this part of the book stresses is that if you buy into the idea of God as the ultimate synthesis, we're not just members of the same family. We're actually worms in the same bloodstream. We're parts of the same organism. And in this book, I explore how this perspective might impel our life, our values, our lifestyles, our senses of self. If you're taking religion seriously of any kind, it shouldn't just affect how you treat God. It should change the way you deal with the world around you, including the way you deal with yourself. So just as I called for a balance in the way we approach God as a synthesis of ultimates, I call for a balance in the way we view ourselves. We must balance the need for humility and the need for pride. We must balance our appreciation for the infinite and our appreciation for the finite. And we do that by never losing sight of the idea that we are worms in the same bloodstream. It is our job to care for ourselves and honor each other. And my conception of God requires public spiritedness. I've always had, and I got this from my father, who was, who kept kosher all his life, but never really talked about God. He had an issue with religious hypocrisy. When people said that they were religious to him, he was good with them as long as they lived like Abraham, Joshua, Heschel. He's down with that, right? But if they feather their nest too much, then Thor's hammers came down. So I have sort of bought into that to some degree, that there's a lot of responsibility in being religious, and responsibility in particular about being publicly spirited. Now, one subject that does take on a prominent role in that part of the book is the interfaith movement, which I see as a fledgling movement, a future antidote rather than a present antidote. I did try. One of the more important parts of the book, I think, is to try to explain what is wrong with the interfaith movement. I mean, to be very terse, it's often on a middle school level. It's appealing to middle school students and not particularly smart ones. We don't want to talk about difficult topics. I'm proud to say at the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society, we actually had a dialogue about the Gaza War during the Gaza War at a mosque. So we don't hide from. We talk about homosexuality. We don't hide from the topics that divide us. But that's because we've been able to create sort of a family environment. So we have each other's backs, whether we agree with each other or not. And we try to be patient with one another when we disagree. Some people say, no justice, no peace. I say no patience, no peace. I think that's far more basic and important, frankly. And I say that as someone who works for justice as a living. So I've identified some way in which this movement can possibly bring us together. But obviously we need to figure out what does unify us, as well as embrace what divides us. And one of my points is that what unifies us are the same basic fundamental principles that we have: truth, justice, peace, liberty, and love. But I must say, I've sort of taken some shots at your faith implicitly in terms of its metaphysic. The most important value to me is love, and no religion that I know of does a better job in emphasizing the primacy of love as does Christianity. So I think this is something that we Jews can stand to learn from our Christian cousins. It's not that we Jews don't care about love. It's just that we may not have devoted as much of an emphasis to that one concept, which you can see not just in terms of civility, but in terms of genuine warmth. Civility is just the beginning. We need to be warm to one another, including when we disagree. So there you have it. I'm going to conclude in a moment and take some questions. A discussion of a book that was entitled God in Three Voices. Originally, that was the working title. God is a concept in our minds, the ultimate concept. God is the ultimate thou we encounter. And God is the ultimate drama in which we play a part. We are part of this God. And I feel very blessed to address a group of people who are willing to take the time to struggle with these concepts, who recognize that there are no answers to these questions. They're just more questions. And I have to say, some people do think of this as an esoteric hobby that we're engaging in, almost a quirky interest. And I remember when a work colleague found that I was into all this stuff, because you can imagine, people at the Department of Justice don't give a damn about this. I mean, it's just like so alien, right? Those of us who do point out how kind of weird this is in that environment. And I remember when a colleague thought, wow, what an odd little hobby you have. This is so interesting. And I kept saying to myself, it's like I'm into falconry. But I mean, that's the society that we live in. And I'm not talking about, you can go out there out and about into areas where people have at best a high school education, and you'll find all sorts of people who are interested. But if you go to professional schools, this is just weird. And I find that just, I don't have a word for it. Well, anyway, I'm honored to be hanging out this morning with fellow God wrestlers. Maybe it is a curious hobby right now, but we know it's part of the essence of religion. And if we keep working on it and we share our passion with others, maybe our interest in God wrestling will become the wave of the future and not merely a throwback to the past. So, thank you guys for doing this week after week. Fire away. Go ahead.
Dan, that was very stimulating for me personally, at least. Where you started in terms of the world around us, the human world around us, not giving a damn, just simply not caring. In some sense, have we not liberated ourselves from the need for an explanation of life by the comfort those of us who are privileged to be here today, not everybody in the world, are enjoying? And if radical dependence was, and a need for some mystery explanation of it, was a part of life in previous centuries, not ours, at least for us. And do we need more of an explanation for the indifference that we see than that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful point. I have to say, the main reason to buy my book is to read what other people say in it. And near the very end, I've got this passage from Santayana, who I adore. And I don't know how familiar you guys are with Santayana. He was Spanish, not Jewish. He's considered an atheist. In the same way that people claim Spinoza and Einstein and whatnot, right? If they're atheists. And he wrote this passage about this man watching his daughter, talking with his daughter at Paestum, who the daughter was asking, who created that train? Was that God who created it? And this man just sort of snuffed all faith out of it, right? This is not God, it's man. This was in the early part of the 20th century. And Santayana is like, this is like the most beautiful anti-atheist passage I've ever read, written by a so-called atheist. And he's like, am I an atheist? Do I believe in God? Well, not in the traditional sense. But how can I possibly enjoy someone destroying the notion of the sublime? Which is what this guy was doing to his daughter. And then he ends. Here then, at the railway station returning from Paestum, where I had been admiring the courage and the dignity with which the Dorians recognized their place in nature and filled it to perfection, I found the brutal expression of the opposite mood. The mood of impatience, conceit, low-minded ambition, mechanical inflation, and the worship of material comforts. And I was like, yeah, that was written in the last century. It really should have. He should have waited. His parents should have had him this century. But that is it. That's the problem. Please.
Your comment about no patience, no peace. I think you mentioned that in connection with the interfaith movement. I wonder if using all of your experience, not just what you're talking about here today, but everything you know from your work, etc., can you give an example of where you think the patience is most needed? Where that phrase applies?
Well, I know for sure in my dealings with, between Zionists and Palestinians. I mean, I'm a Zionist, but I'm not like a big Z Zionist. I don't want to take over the settlements and build them. But there's so little impatience. One thing, sometimes I do this when I'm talking about Middle East peace. I have everybody close their eyes, and when they open their eyes, I'm wearing a Viking jersey, Minnesota Viking jersey. And I'm saying, when I'm watching a football game, I'm watching my team, I'm all about the Vikings, right? I mean, I happen to love the Vikings. And if no matter what happens, it's I'm Viking. But I know people like that in the Middle East peace context. The Palestinians are always right. They give the narrative all the time. That's all they're doing. All they can do is criticize Israel about everything. And then you have the other kind. Oh, they're just self-hating Jews, or it's crazy Palestinians. Every time they open their mouth, you know what jersey they're wearing. You don't even have to say a word, because they're wearing a football jersey. And I say that has no place in peacemaking. So that is one example of it. MSNBC and Fox News. I mean, to me, they're the same. I mean, of course, you can turn on CNN and get wrong news. Maybe it's preferable. Then you get fourth graders trying, as opposed to people who put on the jersey. And they have no patience. It's patience to entertain the other narrative, to try to give something up. Say, well, yeah, there's some validity in what you say. Not to be, one of the things about philosophy that's so awesome as a discipline is you early on get into this notion of, Plato's notion of, you've got the philosopher on one hand and you've got the sophist on the other. Of course, the sophists were the lawyers of their day. And to the sophist, it's just a game, it's just sport. It's just winning and losing. And to a philosopher, that's blasphemy. That's just, so antithetical to the project. So to actually have the patience to try to find that kernel of beauty in what the other guy's saying. It is one thing, by the way, I've never been able to work in the private sector as an attorney. I graduated in 1984. I was in Loretta Lynch's section, actually, at Harvard Law School. So it was cool to have my boss being a former classmate of mine. And the reason why I've never been able to practice in the private sector as an attorney is I like the fact in the government we do have a little discretion to say, I don't give a damn about what the client wants. I work for the United States of America. And I do have that basic problem with the client is right, because then you start lying to yourself. And you're no longer a philosopher. You're an advocate. But let's face it, no matter who you work for as an attorney, you have to make certain compromises. And I do look forward to the day at some point when I never have to practice law again. If I have the money, then probably to be a moron. Please.
I'm reading a book right now about the Nuremberg trials by Townsend. And in that book, he makes a contrast between the Christian idea of forgiveness and the Jewish idea of forgiveness.
Do we have one? No, okay.
I just wondered.
See, if you have our God panel, the imam loves loves to make fun of Muslims. So we're each
There's that
sort of...
criticism about the Christian ideal that we believe in free grace, as Bonhoeffer said, cheap grace. We believe we're safe from the foundations of the world. And so we don't make a great deal about penitence and confession and so on. We do accept that. But grace, amazing grace, is the thing that predominates in the Christian view. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
Well,
and maybe that's the reason why we tend to neglect.
I want to get back to the last comment. Part of being patient is to be patient with pain, to be patient with, having these, this cognitive dissonance in your head. Be patient with suffering for your own sins. I have no affection whatsoever for the idea that, you can rape and murder and all those kinds of things, and if you say, I love Jesus a second before you die, that's okay. I mean, I can't tell you how cold that leaves me. Because, one of the things about which I am agnostic, and this is very common as a Jew, and I'm intentionally agnostic, is the whole idea of what an afterlife would be, the whole idea of what is to come. We try to avoid thinking much about that as Jews because it takes away from what we can do here. As a student of philosophy, I'm sure you can read the book and you get me to say some things, right? Multiple books, frankly, on that. I've written, touched on that. But as a worker in the world, I want to avoid the emphasis on that. I want to talk about what the importance of being virtuous, and how to be virtuous, how to be righteous, right? And taking seriously the idea that every second of every day we can improve. We need to relax, but we also need to improve. So as far as forgiveness is concerned, it is important to be a forgiving person. But it's also important, and I say this as someone who's specialized in fraud for a quarter of a century, it's important to have your eyes open, or as they say in Star Trek, not to lower your shields for the Klingons. You need to be aware. And in this one sense, I do agree with some things about Israel saying, you do need to be aware you're in a tough neighborhood. You can't just assume it's all good. Be smart. But forgiveness and mercy, there are virtues. Aristotle talked about the virtues, like courage. Virtue is a moderate point between too little and too much. Like, being foolhardy is too much. Being cowardly is too little. And the reason why we call courage a virtue is because most of us want more of it. But it's not that the more the better. And I would say that about something like mercy. Yeah. Other comments, questions?
Would you say the same thing about patience? That there's...
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely.
Okay. All right.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Like, sometimes in my profession, you just got to sue them.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the more the better, and you talked about the fact that Islam has this reverence for God, but then there's the whole issue of the more the better maybe is the prophet and the tax and things on people who post pictures of the prophet. Because it somehow, it impacts the reverence piece. And so in the religion, you talk about the positives, or the negatives, all the things you talked about in the sense of the three. We've gone too far one way.
Yeah,
talk about a little bit.
Yeah. Actually, I don't see that as such a negative. There are others. I will defend them in that regard. The explanation I hear as to why at least Muhammad is not depicted is because Muhammad did not want to be deified. And he was concerned that if he were to be depicted as Jesus has been depicted, he would be deified. Now, that actually is a beautiful statement to me. What I don't understand is then why all the prophets, quote, can't be depicted. But yes, they each have problems, don't they? I would say for Islam, what I am finding is that they have not had their Reformation. We certainly, as Jews, have had our, we call it Haskalah. The end of the 18th century, all those Germans who loved Spinoza loved him for a reason, right? They were really deep down Reformed Jews or Reconstructionist Jews at heart, And you all obviously have had the Reformation. Now, this is not to say I'm putting down Catholicism, because most Catholics I know in many ways are Reformed, in their thinking. There is there's this notion in Islam that you're supposed to surrender, you're supposed to submit, is even what the word means. And that means to authority. And God wrestling, per se, you see a little bit of it, but not enough of it. So, I mean, to me, that's more of a problem. This crazy violence that's going on, I have a feeling all of our faiths have been responsible for that at different points in history. I don't really think of Islam as inherently violent, you know. So, I mean, obviously I've talked about issues with Christianity and Judaism. I mean, I think the problem with Judaism is you can just get stuck in a different century or millennium and not grow. And that's one of the things that's exciting about some of these, you know, more progressive branches of Judaism, is that in theory you're all about growth, but in practice it's really easy to be a country club Jew and just say, oh, is it time for the bar mitzvah? You've got to go to school. Is it time for Passover? Oh, great, we'll have a singer. And then the rest of the year, where's the religiosity? So I talk about Heschel, and actually, and I think it was the Creed group. Heschel was 65 when he died. He looked like he was 165. His face took on so much suffering from the angst of just trying to help the world. You know, whether it was Vietnam, the civil rights movement, these spirituality issues, the Holocaust, you could just see it in his face. That's, to me, a Jew. That's a guy who got it. All right, go ahead.
I want to make a comment on an earlier question. Florence said that we don't pay much attention to confession and penitence. The Catholics do, and so did our Protestant originators of the Reformation, Luther and Calvin. I think historically that we have got to the point where we smear around we're all saved, everything is fine, to the point that we forget Jesus' commandments and what he expects us to do as his followers, which I think goes along with something that you said about your own commitments.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. I'm going to go back there, put a little money in there so that you can not pay much. And I'll be available to talk as long as you guys want after this. So thank you.
Thank you.